Hi, and welcome back to Building and Designing Beautiful Websites from Scratch. We are on video 3. And so what we'll talk about today is the HTML macro structure, classes, and IDs. And then we'll briefly touch on CSS. We'll style a little bit in CSS. So here's the review, or the agenda. We're going to do a quick review of where we left off in the last video. We will initiate a macro structure into our HTML documents, and we'll focus. I said all of our HTML documents will focus primarily on the index or the home page. We'll understand how classes and IDs work, and then we will change heading and paragraph styles in our CSS file. So that's the plan. Let's quickly talk about what a macro structure is. So what is a macro structure? It's really a way to organize your HTML file. So it's a way to organize your HTML file that divides it up into the main elements of your website. And so it's really a way of thinking, what are the different components or sections of my website, and how will I divide it up? And really the purpose of introducing a macro structure is really to think ahead to design, right? Because if we're thinking about CSS as a way to change the visual aspects or the visual characteristics of HTML elements, we need a variety of HTML elements introduced into our document. Okay, so hopefully this will make a little sense. I think the best move is to kind of jump into actually introducing a macro structure, and then hopefully it'll start to make more sense to you. I'll talk about classes and IDs really quickly, but this may not make sense until we actually introduce classes and IDs into HTML. So classes and IDs are attributes. So these are optional attributes that can be added to any HTML element. They are ways to uniquely categorize commonly used HTML elements. So for example, the P tag, which is the paragraph tag, is a very commonly used element. You might use it a dozen times or 100 times throughout your website. You might want to specify one type of paragraph tag from another type of paragraph tag. And the only real way to do this is to introduce a class or an ID. So it's to give a unique category to a particular class or ID, to a particular HTML element. So one of the things we can do is we can add, for example, a class called tagline to a paragraph element. And then later on we can, in our CSS file, make changes to this particular class. Again, this may not make perfect sense to you, but I just want to introduce the idea before we jumped in. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show you a website that I found on the awards website, the AWWW awards website. I think if you just Google AWWW awards, it's a really good website that I like to use for design inspiration. So basically it's a website where people can submit beautifully designed websites and then they can rate them. And so you can look through and get inspiration from this website. And so here's a website that I thought had a fairly typical layout, and that I just really liked their bright and light design aesthetic. And so what I want to do is I want to use this as an example of how to think about HTML macro structure. So if we look at this and really any website on the internet, and we can scroll through the main page, you can see that there's distinct and different sections on the website. Right? So if we look at the top, there's a header at the top, and inside of the header there is for sure a navigation bar. Right below this sort of white area that I'm calling the header is like an area for a big image. People usually call this a hero image. So a big hero image, that's another section of the website. Here's a third section where you've got a row of content, some words and some images. And another section where you've got another row of content, some words and some images. And what I really liked about this particular website was the 50-50 layout. They did a sort of a magazine type layout where they've got text on one side and an image on another. And then they sort of reverse the layout, image on one side and text on another. So I really like that layout. So there's some content here, and then at the very bottom you'll see a large area for what we're calling the footer area, right? And so if we had to divide this up into different components or elements of an HTML document, there's a header, there's some content, and there's a footer, right? And so just at its most basic level, regardless of sort of the overall design aesthetic that you choose, every HTML document is going to have a similar layout and a similar macro structure. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open where we left off. Is we had a website that I put in a folder called YouTube website, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the index file in Sublime Text, and we're going to sort of just work in the index file today. So here is what the index file looks like. This is my home page. And what I want to do now is I want to divide this home page into sort of a macro structure. So right now, the natural sort of areas that I think make sense is we've got a header area here where my navigation bar is. We've got some content here. And then we've got, we don't have a footer yet, but I'll introduce a footer element to this page. So if we look back at our HTML file, just as a refresher, everything in the body is what shows up on the page. And right now the page is not really divided in any meaningful way, right? And so what we'll do is we'll start with the header. And so one tag that's really helpful in HTML is HTML5 is the header tag. And so inside of our header, I will just put my navigation bar. So now we're introducing some structural elements, some macro structure into our HTML document. So we've got our header. The next thing we have is some content. So this is just kind of placeholder content, but we have content nonetheless. And one thing that I want to leave a placeholder for is this big hero image. I really like this big hero image, so a big sort of bright image right after the header. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a placeholder for that image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the div tag, and div is short for divider or division. And so the div tag is a really helpful way to divide up your website. So I'm just going to open my div tag and close my div tag, and then just as a reminder, every tag that opens must close. So just as a way of following our best practices, I'm going to open the tag and I'm going to close the tag. And inside of this div tag, I'm going to put in a big image. But right now I don't have the image yet, so I'm not going to worry about that. Now, one thing that you'll notice is if we just left this as a div tag, there's really no way to uniquely identify this div tag as anything different than any other div tag. So this is where classes and IDs come into play. So one thing I can do is I can add a class. And so to add an attribute, just as a reminder, we do our HTML tag, we do a space, and then we add our attribute. So div space class equals, and then in quotation marks, this is where you can call this anything you want. You can call this anything that makes sense to you, but here's a way of just sort of organizing or structuring your HTML document. So I'm going to call this hero image because that is what I'll remember it to be. That's what makes sense to me. And so we use the same sort of naming conventions, file naming conventions that we talked about in the previous video, all lowercase, no spaces. So always all lowercase, no spaces for classes. Okay, so right now we have two sections. We have our header, we have our hero image, and then we've got some content. I'm going to create a div, again, that surrounds all of this content. And I'm just going to put a space so you can kind of clearly see the different sections of this website. And again, we want to give this some more information, so I'm going to add a class to this section of content. I'm going to call it content. Okay, so that's just a way to remind me, okay, this is content. Everything inside of this div tag is content. Everything inside of this div tag is my hero image. Everything inside of this header tag is obviously header information. Okay, so really introducing the macro structure. We've got 1, 2, 3 sections so far, and then I want to create a footer. Okay, so at the bottom of every website is, most every website is some footer information. So in our footer, usually you'll find things like contact information. So what I'll do is I'll just create a heading using the H1 tag, and you can follow along, and I'll call it contact information. And then I will create a list of my contact information. So I'm going to open up the UL tag, unordered list, and I'm going to add list items. So I'm going to add my contact information. So maybe I'll say phone number 123-111-1111. That's obviously not my real phone number. And then address, maybe 123 Fake Street. And email, fake@fake.com. Okay, so here's just sort of some placeholder text. You may want to change this up as you start to develop your website, but just some things that you might find in your footer. So if I refresh my index page, you'll notice nothing really looks different. And again, I'm reinforcing this idea of HTML is all structure, not visual design. So again, it's supposed to look like this at this point. But what we've done now is we've introduced 4 elements. We've introduced a header, we've introduced a hero image, we've introduced content, and we've introduced a footer. So 4 separate elements, and we can see header, our hero image is not there yet because we haven't added an image yet. We're introducing content here, and then we're introducing our footer. Now, one thing I do want to add before we move on is I really liked this layout where there's an image and text. So text and then an image. So what I will do is I will introduce that sort of placeholder as well in here. So maybe I'll do div class content image as a placeholder, and I'll close that div. So that would be the image eventually, and then div class content would be sort of this right or this left text. And so we've got now 5 sections: content, content image, content, footer, header, hero image. Okay, so we've got our 5 sections. At this point, we've introduced our macro structure, and we're good to go in terms of dividing the content into different sections. Okay, so the next step is to introduce CSS, because now that we've created this macro structure, we can actually now make visual design changes to these HTML elements. And so the interesting thing about CSS is a different language that works alongside HTML, and it allows you to basically say, I want to call up or select any HTML tag, and I want to make some visual design change to that HTML tag. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll create a new file, and we will save it in our same folder. Make sure this is in the same folder as all of the rest of your files, and we'll call it style.css. Okay. And so one thing we need to do though is, just because we created a folder or a file called style.css does not mean it magically is connected to our HTML documents. So what we have to do is we have to connect our CSS document to our HTML document. So to do this, connect CSS to HTML. If you just Google this and click the first link, you can find how to do that right here. And so you can kind of scroll down to external CSS, copy and paste where it says link rel style sheet href style.css, and I'm going to put that in my inside of my head tag. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to open up all three of my pages, my contact and my resume page as well, and I'm going to add, and this is actually styles.css. Make sure that whatever is in your hypertext reference attribute within the quotes matches exactly to the letter what the name of your CSS file is. So I'm going to do the same thing for my contact.html page, just for future reference. We're not going to mess with it. But this is what connects this CSS file, which has nothing in it, with our HTML file. Okay, so we've connected the two. And so now what we can do is we can make design changes to any of these elements, HTML elements on the page. And so CSS, and you can read more about CSS, but CSS is a pretty simple language, and it really has three major components. The first is what's called the selector. So the selector is what HTML element you're selecting to make a design change to. So we have H1s we have multiple H1s in our HTML document. So one thing we can do is we can select H1, so you can follow along with me. So to select an HTML element, you just type in the HTML element. Then to actually create a style, you have to use the curly bracket, so it's the shift bracket, the opening curly bracket, and the closing curly bracket. So this is sort of a different syntax than HTML, but just kind of follow along with me. So you've got our selector, and then you can change an attribute of that element. So the second component of CSS is the attribute, and so we can change things like font size. So to change an attribute, you would type in the attribute name, you'd add a colon, a space, and then the third element or the third characteristic of CSS is the value. So each attribute needs a value. So for font size, we can change the value of the font size to 36 pixels, for example. Okay, so if we refresh, you can see that the heading 1s, the things marked as heading 1, got bigger. And we can even see that even more pronounced if we change this to like 106 pixels. It's going to be huge, right? So I don't know why you'd ever want your font that large, but I just want to show you how you can change the different elements. So part of understanding CSS is you don't need to memorize all of the attributes. You just kind of have to know how to Google them, right? So if you Google something like change font color in CSS, you can find how to do that. So you'll see, oh, the color property is used to set the color of the text. So we can change our font size. We can change our color to, let's change it to red, for example. And it changes all of the H1s to red. Okay. We can also change elements. We can also change, make changes to elements like paragraph tags and ordered list tags. So let's do that. So again, just as an example, our selector would be P for paragraph, and then we would open our curly brackets, and then we would just need to pick an attribute. So let's say I wanted to change the font. So change font in CSS. We go to our reference, and you can change what's called font families, right? And so you can choose different font families based on the different fonts. So we can say font-family, and then let's just say Helvetica is a good one. And then if you have multiple attributes you want to change for a particular selected element, you use the semicolon, as you may have noticed. So we can change the font family, we can change the font size, for example. So let's change it to 20 pixels. And we can change the color. Let's change it to gray instead of black. Okay, so we're changing 3 elements on our paragraph tag. And so you can see anything that is marked up as a paragraph tag is now Helvetica, 20 pixels, and gray. We can do the same thing for, so if we want our paragraphs and our lists to look the same, what we can do is we can go into this selector and we can do comma, and we can add our list element to this particular style. So if we refresh, now all of our lists are Helvetica, gray, and 20 pixels. Okay, so that's sort of just an introduction to CSS. We're going to get more advanced in the next video, but what I want to reiterate is by the end of this video you should have created your macro structure, added these HTML elements. You should have been able to link your CSS style sheet to your HTML files, and then made some really basic changes to our HTML elements. So that's what we'll leave off now. We'll pick up next week on some more advanced CSS, and then really starting to think about layout and moving things around on the page.